Now first, let's orient with some evidence, or orient with some chronology. One thing you should be aware of, in the ancient world, the average life expectancy for someone who survived childhood was only 48. So back then, a lifetime is about half what it is today. And that's significant because it means witnesses die off a lot sooner and things can change and get lost in history a lot quicker. Now, the religion definitely began sometime around 30 AD, no matter what the case. But the first documents we get of any mention of Christianity or Jesus or anything are the epistles of Paul that end up in the New Testament. Now, several of those we know, mainstream consensus is that they're forgeries. Paul didn't write them. But 7 of them, it is generally believed he did write those 7, even if he wrote them in different forms and stuff originally. But those documents are the first documents we have for the Christian church. And they only refer to visions. I'm going to talk about that a little more later. They'd never talk about Jesus having a ministry or anyone ever having met him in life. The first time anyone ever meets him or encounters him is after his death. And there are a variety of different ways to interpret the epistles, but there's no direct claim that he was actually a guy walking around on earth in the epistles, the authentic ones. The Gospels come yet another lifetime later by ancient standards. About 40 years after the beginning of the religion, you start to see Gospels, and then they get written over a span of time between 75 and 115 AD maybe. And that's the first time we hear of any biography. So we go from no ordinary memoirs, no ordinary history, and just immediately right out of the gate, wild religious mythologies about this guy. So there's no middle ground present in the historical record. And then all other evidence comes later. You'll often hear people talking about Josephus being late 1st century, but the evidence is pretty clear that either he didn't mention Jesus or we can't establish that he originally mentioned Jesus. Other people sort of inserted mentions of Jesus into his text. The first very clear examples of someone not a Christian, something outside the New Testament, that mentions Jesus, we're already about 115 AD and later, so we're already a really long time after the beginning of the religion, and all those references appear to simply refer back to the Gospels or to Christians citing the Gospels. So we have no independent corroboration of the Gospels. And this produces an unusual sequence of evidence. The epistles, they only speak of a pre-existent celestial being and a revealed gospel. There are a number of places where Paul says the gospel is known through revelation and hidden messages in the scriptures, like the idea that it's known because Jesus preached it in Galilee is not in Paul at all. And the Gospels come a lifetime later and are wildly fictional. Even the stuff in it that's not miraculous is unrealistic and implausible. And I'll give you some examples later. And yet all later attestations to the historicity of Jesus are based on the Gospels. So these fictional stories come out. Even if Jesus existed, these are fictional stories about him. And all later references are referencing these. So there's no independent evidence. And all other evidence from the first 80 years of Christianity's development was conveniently not preserved, not even in quotation or refutation. In other words, a great deal of other literary activity that would have been happening, including tons of other letters, don't survive. Not only do they not survive, we don't even have mentions of them. So the evidence has been pretty well scrubbed. And then all other evidence we have is forged in its place. We have dozens of Gospels, at least 6 versions of Acts, hundreds of fake epistles, doctored passages, and so on. And when you look at Christian literature, you take, for example, Gospels, Acts, and epistles, and you count the number of, everyone agrees these are forgeries against the ones that people think might be authentic. The ratio comes to be between 5-to-1 to 10-to-1 forgery to authentic, which means that forgery was the normal mode of literary production for Christians in the first 3 centuries. So that tells you something, how the evidence is kind of messed with. It's highly unreliable. Stuff's been taken away, stuff's been faked and messed with and altered. So you have to really get at the truth. You've got to go through this lens that's been hugely messed up to prevent you from seeing the truth of how it actually began. And you have to look for clues that sort of escaped that net. Now, what's the alternative explanation? Let's suppose Jesus didn't exist. How then do we explain Christianity? There are some unusual yet indisputable facts that we can first cue you in on. One is that some pre-Christian Jews had already identified a character in the Old Testament named Jesus as a supreme archangel and God's firstborn son. So that belief already pre-existed Christianity. What Christianity did is they taught that their Jesus was that archangel. So they're taking an angel that already existed in Jewish angelology and attributing it to their guy. Now, that could be done for a historical guy. They could be saying that there was a historical Jesus. He's this angel who came down and taught us things. But either way, whether it's that or not, they definitely have already borrowed this Jesus figure from Jewish angelology before their time. And what they taught that was different from what other Jews were teaching about this angel was that this angel, archangel, descended, incarnated, was killed, and resurrected. That's the unique part of Christianity as a Jewish sect, that they have this particular doctrine. And they teach this doctrine in parallel to Satan's cosmic story. And if you know Satan, the story of Satan rebelling in heaven and being cast down, he's not cast down to earth, he's cast down into the upper heavens, or the lower heavens below the moon. He sits up in the sky and sky castles 100,000 miles away, sending his demons down to meddle with us and whatnot. That's standard in Jewish demonology of the ancient times. But that whole story was read out of Scripture. It was found in there, or people wrote books about it. It's obviously not historical. There was no Satan. There was no war in heaven. It's a myth. So Satan is a non-historical person who the Jews put into history and made a historical character. And he's also an archangel. And Jesus, his role, I'll show you later, reverses the role of Satan. Satan rebelled, Jesus submitted, and thereby, when Satan rebelled, he brought death and all the horrible things into the world. By Jesus submitting, he canceled all of the evils that Satan caused. So Jesus and Satan are mythically designed to be oppositions. Jesus was designed to sort of cancel out Satan in Jewish mythology. So here's the alternative theory, that these events were not revealed by actually happening. The death, incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus were not witnessed by anyone. They were actually revealed through private visions only to elect persons, the apostles. And that Jesus was actually killed by Satan and his sky demons in his kingdom above the clouds. Now you might think that sounds weird. Why would that be? Actually, we have a Christian text called the Ascension of Isaiah, written roughly around the same time as the canonical Gospels, that originally once actually said this, that Jesus was killed by Satan and his demons in outer space. And there's some clues as well as that other sects were teaching this, but those sects all disappeared by the mid-2nd century, and we don't get to hear anything more about them. We have no documents from them. The Ascension of Isaiah only survives in doctored copies in different versions, where people were trying to erase this part of it. But because we have different traditions in different languages, we're able to reconstruct something of the original. And this, again, reversed the fall of Satan. Satan failed the test, being given the opportunity to be equal to God, and he tried to seize all power and rebelled. Jesus was given the opportunity to be equal to God, and he submitted all the way to death, and therefore canceled that out. There's another parallel, and I'll get to some examples later. In the adjacent province, so in Judea, the adjacent province was Egypt, which had a huge flourishing Jewish community. There's a lot of pilgrim travel between Judea and Egypt at the time, so there's a lot of cultural communication going on. The main savior god in Egypt was Osiris, and Osiris has the same model, where he was placed in history as a pharaoh who lived in a particular historical time, lived on earth, and was killed and resurrected and ascended to heaven. That's the version that was sold to the public, but the priests talked among themselves and said that actually wasn't true, that was just an allegory for the real thing that happens, which is that Osiris descends just below the moon, where he's killed by the equivalent of Satan in Egyptian mythology, and resurrects. So they had the cosmic version of, just like I'm talking about here, that was the real version, and then they had these public stories they created. And of course, in Osiris's case, Egyptian history is superbly well documented back thousands of years, so we can actually confirm there was never an Osiris. So we do know he was a non-existent person. So we have this exact same model to go by, and it's going on in the exact same province. So it wouldn't be so out of the ordinary for it to occur in Judea. Now, analogous analogous Jewish sects. Notice I say Jewish sects. All these religions I've listed here are actually just sects of Judaism. People try to think of them as distinct. No, Christianity is just a Jewish sect. They changed some things. Mormonism is just a version of Christianity, therefore it's just a version of Judaism. Islam is just a version of Christianity, which is just a version of Judaism. In fact, Islam looks a lot like the original Christian sect, which was Torah observant. The original Christian sect said no bacon, etc., circumcised and all of that. Islam says no bacon, circumcised, and all of that. So they're actually still retaining a lot of the original Torah observant Christian elements. So Islam is a sect of Christianity. It just grew up in a particular region and got very successful, more successful than other heretical sects. But as a sect of Christianity, it's really just a sect of Judaism. So technically, Islam is just Judaism 3.0 or something. So, but what do they all have in common? Mormonism, you know the story. Joseph Smith has conversations with the angel Moroni and seeing words on magical plates, and the Book of Mormon records what those things said. Islam, Muhammad has conversations with the angel Gabriel, and the Quran records the spoken teachings of Gabriel, as speaking as the voice of God. Christianity, this theory would say that the Apostle Peter has conversations with the angel Jesus, and the New Testament records the hidden deeds and teachings of that angel. That would be the analogy for this alternative explanation for the origins of Christianity. The one thing that happened differently is that, like all other savior gods in that particular period, they got historicized, even though they didn't exist originally. The same thing happened to this angel. He got historicized in a way that Moroni and Gabriel did not. Now, can we argue against that theory? There are a variety of different attempts to try and say that that can't be. I wish I had the slide showing Luke Skywalker saying, he can't be my father. That's impossible. But I'll point out some of the best ones. This is the best attempts to argue it. You really can't get it from the Gospels because the Gospels are so dubious and have no sourcing. So the Gospels aren't useful. You can't get it from extra-biblical evidence because they're all based on the Gospels, so they can't independently corroborate them. So it leaves you with epistles, those 7 authentic epistles of Paul, and that's really all we have. So we've got to kind of dig in there. If you want to prove there was a historical Jesus, you've got to find it in there. And one of the places that the people who defend historicity find it is that twice Paul refers to this group of people called the brothers of the Lord. And the assumption is, those are the biological brothers of Jesus, therefore he must have really existed. The problem is that the only brothers of the Lord Paul ever talks about knowing anything about are cultic brothers of the Lord. All baptized Christians are adopted sons of God and therefore brothers of each other and therefore brothers of the Lord. Paul says Jesus is the firstborn of many brethren, meaning we're all brothers of the Lord. So those passages become ambiguous. Does he mean baptized Christians or does he mean biological brothers of Jesus? He never says, and you would think if he the only version he talks about explicitly are the cultic version, if he's going to refer to a biological version, he would have to specify it. You have to say like brothers of the Lord in the flesh or something like that to really emphasize, I don't mean baptized Christians, I mean the actual biological brothers of Jesus. But he never actually seems aware of the need to make that distinction. So it does suggest that actually when he uses that phrase, he only means the cultic version. But at best, it's ambiguous. We can't really build anything off of that. There are a couple of passages where two passages. The one passage where it says, you'll often see it translated that he's descended from David. Descended from David is not in the Greek. It actually says, literally in the Greek, it says manufactured from the sperm of David. And there's another reference to him being born of a woman. It's the exact same word, manufactured out of a woman. Now, in the case where you're talking about David, that's ambiguous. What do you mean manufactured out of the sperm of David? Do you mean literally, or do you mean, is that a reference to descent? What does that actually mean? It's ambiguous. The word that Paul uses there, and also uses in the case of the woman passage, the word Paul uses there is the word that Paul uses for divine manufacture. It's for when he mentions the creation of Adam, he uses that word. When he mentions the creation of our future resurrection bodies, which, by the way, are waiting for us in heaven, like empty zombie shells for us to go inhabit. And I'm not kidding. That's 2 Corinthians 5. Paul's very explicit. Those bodies are already there waiting for us. Paul uses the same word. So he's not talking about birth from like natural birth, the way we're talking about. When Paul does refer to natural birth, he uses a different word in the Greek. And this was so disturbing to Christians that we have examples, and Bart Ehrman shows this in his book, Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. We have examples of Christians trying to change the one word to the other because they know Paul's using the word for manufacture and he's using a different word for birth, so they tried to switch it over on both of these passages. So we have manuscripts where we have the attempts by scribes to screw with it, but those are late. So we have earlier manuscripts in that can establish that, no, that isn't actually the reading, and everybody now agrees Paul used the disturbing word rather than the obvious word. Another example is when he's talking about the born of a woman. Actually, Paul's argument there is allegorical, and he explicitly says, I'm talking about allegorical women. I don't mean an actual biological woman. I mean the world order to which you are born. So if you're born into a particular world, you have a particular mother. But that can get into the debate over the semantics of the rhetoric of Paul and so on. I think ultimately it gets ambiguous. So once again, these are very ambiguous passages. They're not particularly good evidence for historicity. But to get back to that James example, I'll give you an example of why the mainstream views are often based on long-held Christian faith assumptions that actually don't hold up when you look at the evidence. And this is an example. Everybody assumes Jesus had a brother named James, but when you look at the evidence, it doesn't really hold that up. Jesus had a brother named James who was a head in the church, a leader of the church. The evidence doesn't hold that up. None of the brothers of Jesus, not James, Jude, or anyone in the New Testament, are said to be apostles anywhere in the entire New Testament. So we actually don't have an explicit statement saying that any of the brothers of Jesus were apostles. Even the book of Acts has no knowledge of this being the case. So the one place where we have the origins, the history of Christianity from its first public announcement in its first 30 years, at no point is there a brother of Jesus leading the church, not James, not anybody. The letters we have in the New Testament by James and Jude, neither of those letters say they are the brother of Jesus. Mark has Jesus disown his brothers just outright, like, you aren't my brothers anymore, these are my brothers. And so he shows no knowledge of any of them ever joining the church. Luke alone puts them all in the church in Acts 1, but then they vanish from history, like I said. And so do his mom and dad, by the way. They're somehow, as soon as you get the actual history of the church, all the family of Jesus disappear. The first time his brothers appear as apostles is in wildly ridiculous stories written over a century later. So you see the legend seems to be growing in that direction. The family gets invented over time in just the same way that the family of Moses was invented over time. And everybody who's not a fundamentalist now agrees that Moses is a fictional person, that he was mythical, he didn't exist. And yet he has named brothers and sisters and so on. So merely having named brothers and sisters does not make you a historical person. Fictional people have brothers and sisters too. And there's other passages in Paul. People will refer to, well, Paul says Jesus describes the Last Supper at right before he's executed. And he says, well, actually, Paul never calls it the Last Supper. That would have been a useful thing, because that would suggest that there were lots of other suppers before it. No, he only calls it the Lord's Supper, and he says he received it directly from the Lord. In other words, what he communicates there is from a vision. He's hallucinating or dreaming or claiming to hallucinate or dream and claiming he received it that way, not from any witnesses. And when he describes the Eucharist event, there's no one else present. He doesn't mention anyone being there. It's just Jesus communicating it to his community spiritually. There's a reference to the rulers of this age crucifying him, but who are they? Paul never uses it. The phrase is archons of this aeon, meaning princes of this universe or princes of this cosmic era. He never uses that phrase of human leaders or rulers. He uses similar terminology to refer to the demonic forces that rule the world. So is he talking about Satan and his demons, or is he talking about Romans? Is he talking about Jews? We're not sure. People will say, well, Paul outright says the Jews killed him. That's in 1 Thessalonians, except pretty much like 80% of mainstream experts agree that that's an interpolation. The passage where Paul blames the Jews for killing Jesus is not only has historical mistakes in it, so it's factually impossible that Paul would write it, but it also contains an un-Pauline anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism reflects later Christian thought, not Paul's thought itself. It contradicts the things he said about the Jews elsewhere. So that passage, people generally agree, was something that someone added to the text that wasn't originally in Paul. And then you'll hear someone will say, well, Paul says that he confessed before Pontius Pilate in 1 Timothy, but all mainstream scholars agree that 1 Timothy is a forgery. Paul did not write that. So the evidence looks dodgy when you start looking at it. And so when you actually start picking at each piece of evidence and it dissolves, and you start comparing the two different hypotheses as to how well they explain the evidence that remains, that's what I do in the book. I look at all the evidence everybody's presented, both pro and con. That's why it's so huge. Plus, I give a lot of important background knowledge that you can use to understand and interpret that evidence. And I find, even being as generous as I can to the historicity hypothesis, I still find a 2 in 3 chance that the alternative hypothesis is a better explanation, is the one that's true for the origins of Christianity. Now, that still means there's a 1 in 3 chance that there's a Jesus, that he really was an ordinary Jesus, and that's how the religion started. So that's on the most generous side. And then when I look at it in the way that I think in terms of the most skeptical side, I come to 12,000 to 1 odds against the historicity of Jesus. So those are my margins of error. They're very wide because the data is really crappy. So why would they do that? Here's a clue. 2 Peter, they're in the gospel, there's 1 Peter and 2 Peter. They are written by different people. The authorial style of both of them is so radically different that we know they were not written by the same person. And 2 Peter refers to 1 Peter, which means it's a dead giveaway that 2 Peter is a forgery. So everybody agrees 2 Peter is a forgery. A lot of scholars think that 1 Peter is also a forgery. I think they're wrong, but that's not relevant because 1 Peter never actually places Jesus in history as something witnessed, so that's a problem. But 2 Peter is definitely a forgery. Everybody agrees. Now, the interesting thing is why would they forge it? What are they doing in it? And if you read 2 Peter, its main message is to say this, that we did not follow cleverly devised myths. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. And then immediately forges an eyewitness account of meeting Jesus on earth. And it does this to answer not critics of Christianity, but they're attacking fellow Christians, otherwise unknown Christians who were claiming that such a Jesus was a cleverly devised myth, not something someone met in person. So that's why this letter is forged to attack that sect of Christians, which kind of gives us a clue that there was such a sect of Christians to attack. Now, the thing is, we're not told anything else about that sect. We have none of their documents. We don't know the name of the sect. We know nothing about them. Everything was purged and destroyed. So here we know there was a sect saying this, but we're not allowed to see anything about when that sect originated, what they were saying, what their documents were, or anything like this. This is an example of a clue that slipped through the lens, the distorted lens that was created. Now, why the allegory, the Gospels being originally allegorical, why that eclipsed mystery? Various scholars have proposed different theories. The null thesis is that we see this all the time. Actually, we look at the cargo cults, you look at the ancient mystery cults, you look at the Hadith. It's the natural progression to start historicizing and inventing history and inventing persons that did things and said things. Religions tend to do this. So it actually makes sense that they would. Another example that we have is Origen himself. This is a Christian scholar of the 3rd century. He actually let slip in a discourse once that he says that you have to control the masses and to control the illiterate, lower-ranking, pew-filling Christians, it requires feeding them literal stories and letting them believe that they're literally true because they're not educated enough and not advanced enough to understand the allegorical meaning. And you need to save them, or otherwise they're going to die and then they'll end up in hell. So to save them, it's better to just let them believe the literal stories. And then if they move up enough and get enough education and can then you can let them in and say, okay, these things are just allegories. You got to understand the true story is not the literal part. That's a clue to the kind of mindset of the Christian elite of this particular sect, the sect that he was in, and the sect that eventually gained power and decided all documents that would survive. That's kind of the mindset. So they're actually trending towards, let's try selling the allegory as literal because it's a better way to grow a large church because it's really hard to pack the pews with people when you're trying to explain this complicated, highfalutin, allegorical version of Jesus. It's better. They're much more impressed by the literal Jesus. So the trend was to stick to a more literal Jesus. Another factor is the 1st century bottleneck. We have the letter of Pliny the Younger, the first time in history that any non-Christian we have mentions the existence of Christians. In 110 AD, he writes a letter about this. And what that letter reveals is that there actually were extremely few Christians. Like, there were so few. This guy, Pliny the Younger, was the most legally experienced person in the empire. He's, it's hard to explain. There's a whole list of all his offices he's held for decades. And yet he'd never been present at a trial of Christians, didn't know what they were guilty of, and didn't know what punishments to exhibit. And so he has to ask the emperor. And another thing that he points out is that most of the people that he interviewed, there was an anonymous list of accusing people of being Christians. He interviewed them. Most of them had quit being Christians like 20 years before or 10 years before. So he was very few people were actually still Christians. And there's so few of them that even Pliny the Younger didn't even know what they were guilty of or why they were illegal. He eventually punished them for being an illegal assembly. In the ancient Roman Empire, they didn't have amendment rights that would allow rights of peaceable assembly. To assemble, you actually had to get a license from the state, and if you didn't, it was automatically assumed that you were organizing and agitating against the state. So the opposition to Christians was not religious, it was political. The fact that they're meeting at night or meeting without the permission of the state simply looked suspicious to the state and was literally illegal. So it had nothing really to do with there being a religion originally. That changed in subsequent centuries. But the point being is that this shows that there were so few Christians by 110 AD you can understand why it would be easy for the history of the church to radically alter. It would just take a few people to start selling a different version, and there's not enough people left to gainsay that version of things because the religion was kind of dying out, and then someone re-exploded it by publishing these books to try and sell Jesus and pushing the literal version. So it was actually easy to get one to eclipse the other. Now, another factor is historical accident. The sect that was most promoting the historical Jesus versus, for example, in 2 Peter, the sect that letter was forged to attack, that letter was forged by the sect that actually eventually gained Constantine's ear, the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor who started shifting money around from pagan temples to Christian churches and actually really got Christianity into the empire as a state religion. And that turned out to be the most fundamentalist and literalist sect of them all. Constantine, for example, the tutor he chose for his children was Lactantius, and Lactantius was like the Ken Ham of the ancient world. This was a time when I give a whole lecture on this Canada tour about ancient science, that all educated people of that time knew the Earth was a sphere. They had really good multiple corroboratory empirical evidences that the Earth was a sphere. Lactantius wasn't having it. He said, I dismiss all that evidence. It's impossible for the Earth to be a sphere because that means there's upside down people on the other side of it, and that's just ridiculous. So this is the sect that actually gained political power and then eventually decided what books and stuff to survive. So that's a big factor in determining which version of Christianity ended up prevailing in history. And that, like I said, that sect had absolute power, decided all document survival for 1,000 years, with very few exceptions, like the Nag Hammadi find, but that comes in early Middle Ages, or these few surviving sects stashed some of their documents in pots in the early Middle Ages, and they survive for us to find them today. But we have very little that's earlier than that, and certainly nothing earlier than 150 AD. So the first 100 years of Christianity are a blank to us. All that evidence, all the original sects, all the evidence of them is gone.